guys, so thanks for tuning in, and I thought I'd just do a quick walk around video showing you my car. This is a 1979 911 SC. Now it's actually an Australian delivered car, factory right hand drive, and I did say it was an SC, but obviously you can see it's got the wider fenders and these really cool retro grills here and the big box flares. So whilst it did start as a 911 SC in the 90s, this car was heavily modified, cosmetically mainly, to make it look like a roof. So the fellow that owned this car, he actually worked for Porsche, one of the Porsche dealerships. He actually still works there all these years later. But in the 90s, he commissioned to have this car completely stripped and on a rotisserie. So he had it changed in colour. It used to be silver, which I honestly thought I would have preferred silver, and I really wish it was silver. Well, I thought that when I bought the car, but now that I've gotten used to this colour, it really gets a lot of attention. People comment on it, and yeah, it does stick out. There isn't another one like it. In addition to that, he's also put on a set of ginormous roof speedline wheels. So these are the genuine roof wheels, and they are 17 by 10s in the rear and 17 by 9 in the front. Just give you a look at the colour there. So in addition to things like the exterior, the interior's had a pretty good makeover as well. He did actually do things like a black Alcantara roof, which, you know, I'm not that sort of fussed about, but it's there. And a new dash pad, new door cards, and it's even got a set of Recaros, which probably not a big deal, but at the time these weren't available in Australia, so he actually had to have them imported from Germany. So these are Recaro A8s. As you can see, the interior is in reasonably tidy condition. It's a pretty nice car. Slightly questionable, the choice of the roof-mounted antenna. That's a little bit sort of weird, but I guess back in the early 90s that would have been considered a pretty sort of far out kind of a modification, which no one else would have had at the time. So the other major modification that this car had was back in the early 90s, the engine was rebuilt. So now obviously this isn't how they'd rebuilt it. I did this, I'll tell you about that in a second, but let me give you the backstory. The 3-litre SC engine was pulled out and rebuilt as a 3.1 litre. So they'd utilised a set of turbo barrels, which are 97 millimetres in diameter, and a set of Max Moritz style wedge-shaped pistons. And it still stayed as a stock 3.1 litre SC engine, and had a Monty muffler and a set of SSI heat exchangers, and looked the part. The guy that I bought this car from, I met him because he was selling a car at the time. This is years ago up here in Brisbane, and he was selling a car, and I didn't end up buying that car, which I probably should have, but we became reasonably good friends. And he ended up moving back to Canberra, and then somehow, I don't know how, but he acquired this car from somebody else who had the engine disassembled into 1,000 pieces, or however many pieces there are in one of these engines. So when he got the car, he was tasked with rebuilding the gearbox and also putting the engine back together. Now, when he put the engine together, he didn't do a full rebuild. He just put it back together, new set of rings, and resealed it. And he just basically wanted to see what sort of condition it was in and how it ran, etc., and have a little bit of fun. But it was plagued with the typical CIS issues, which is vacuum leaks, things not being set up correctly, etc. And so when he had it, it was just a bit of a pain in the bum for him. So he never really got round to enjoying it. It would start after about 30 seconds to a minute. It would run really lean and it wouldn't stay running anymore, etc., etc. So he ended up agreeing to sell it to me. So the car turns up on the back of a truck, and I play with the mixture screw and realise that it's probably not set correctly. And before you know it, I've got it running. But it still wasn't perfect, so I ended up pulling the engine out within, I don't know, a few days of having the car. I pulled the engine out, put it on my test stand, and I set up the sensor plate, set up the control pressures, got it running perfectly on the test stand in the garage. I put it back in the car, and to be honest, it was running like a top. It would start on the button. It was perfect. So every single time you go to start the car, you just turn the key. Within half a revolution, it was started, it was running, cold starts, hot starts. It was perfect. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. And it would have been the poster child for a perfectly running CIS system for an SC. And the car stayed like that for 3 years. But because I rebuild engines, as I may or may not have said earlier, I do rebuild these engines for other people. And this car does look, it looks like a fast car with the big wide hips and the big wheels and the big intakes, the scoops. And you can't just have a car that looks fast and then just drives around with 180 horsepower. It's a bit like the roof cars. I mean, I sort of see the roofs driving around and I think, well, they look fast, but they just got nothing underneath the bonnet. So why? So my goal was to either rebuild it as a 3.5 litre ITB car, which I've done a few of now, or for a turbo. And I haven't done a turbo before, and I haven't done my own EFI system. So that's what I decided to do. So about 12 months ago, I pulled the engine out, and I've committed myself to doing a full rebuild, sorry, not a full rebuild, a full conversion. So I haven't opened up the engine at all, but what I have done is I have added a turbocharger, and I've also converted it to EFI. So I'll try and show you the turbo underneath here. There you go, there's a turbo. There's the J-pipe, and there's the wastegate. So I've done a few engines. I've done 3.5 ITB engines before, and like they're pretty responsive, but I've not done a turbo. I've never really driven one, and I haven't made my own EFI harness before. And I know that when you're doing an EFI conversion, if you have to pay someone to make you a harness, it is very expensive. The last couple I did, we had to buy harnesses that were ready-made by guys over in the US, and they're like $5,000 for a harness. And yeah, you're paying for expertise. I'm not saying that they're overcharging, I'm just saying that it's not cheap. So I wanted to see whether I could make my own harness and see if it would work, and see whether I could do a turbo conversion. And as it turns out, I can. So what I've done is I've used a set of 3.2 litre intake manifolds, fuel rails. You probably can't see it, but I've got the adjustable fuel pressure regulator in the back there. That's from Adapt Motorsport. And on this side here, I'm not sure again if you can see it, but down there is I've replaced the distributor with a pickup unit from Adapt Motorsport. So that sort of has two Hall effect sensors in it. One is to measure the crankshaft rotation speed, and the other one is to measure the cylinder position, i.e. camshaft location. So it knows when to fire, and I've got sequential injection. I'm just using coil on plug. I've got an electronic boost controller there, or 3-port Mac valve, and I ended up putting in a quick disconnect on the side of the engine here, so that if I need to drop the engine, I don't have to unplug everything. And on the side here, I've got a fuse box with relays in it, so each system has its own relay. So that was stage one. Stage one was putting the turbo on, putting the exhaust on, putting the intake manifolds on, and I test ran it on the stand. For the ECU, I've actually used a company here in Australia. His name is Rama, and he runs Racehead Engineering, and he distributes the ECU Master ECU, and that's just tucked underneath the passenger seat. And what I love about this is that it actually works well. I love it because it works really well, but it also has a cool little, see if I can show you this, a little data logger there. And it also transmits via Bluetooth, so you can use that to transmit to a phone. So you can see all your data on the screen. So I'll just start it up. Let's see whether this makes a mock, see if this will work. There we go. Cool. So you can obviously change you can change all the parameters on the screen there, but it's handy to have things like intake air temperature and also the engine coolant as well, and also your air fuel ratio. I'm using AFR as opposed to lambda, but I can always change that. And as you can see, my temperature sensor is moving around a little bit. That's because I do have a slightly dodgy connection and I do need to change the sensor. And for tuning, I'll see if I can get my laptop running. Whoop. So that's the ECU master computer layout, and you've got different tables, things for like idle and whatnot. But they have a handy little tune display down here which just gives you a summary of some of the important bits and pieces. And I'll zoom in on that so you can see it, but you can actually see so it's doing its thing. But yeah, so it's kind of fun to sort of drive around and keep an eye on temperatures and whatnot, but it is handy to have this little display in the car hooked up to your phone. Oh, laptop just fell off the seat. That's handy. So everybody always asks me, how much power does it make? How much power does it make? How much power does it make? So the thing I have to make clear is that I have not rebuilt this engine yet. Yes, I've rebuilt plenty of engines for other people and for myself, but not this one. This one, it just runs too nicely. So it is running high compression, like 9.8 to 1 compression, which is a little bit too high to put much boost in. So I am limiting it to 0.6 of a bar of boost. And all the tuning has actually been done by this guy. Yes, I've done all the tuning, and I'm not a tuner, but with a lot of reading and a lot of subscribing to forums and watching videos and just getting a feel for, you know, what it's supposed to do, talking to the right people, this car, the very first time I drove it, it just drove perfectly. The first tune was done by Rama who sells the ECUs. He sort of logged in remotely, roughed in a really quick tune, got it running, and I just drove it out of my driveway around the street, around the block, and it just went perfectly. And I just couldn't believe how good it was. It didn't make a lot of power, but everything was working. And then I just slowly, you know, played with the timing, cleaned up the fueling, log, keep cleaning up the fueling, doing a bit more driving, and just, you know, wash, rinse, repeat. And eventually I got it running pretty nicely. So in the end, I did take it to a shop to put it on the dyno just to test some of my work, and because I feel like it's a fairly conservative tune. I'm not really trying to make a lot of power. I mean, as I said, it's running too much compression, and the engine hasn't been rebuilt properly, and there are a couple of small oil leaks, which, you know, I didn't build it, so it's allowed to leak. But yeah, I would like to get those fixed. And on the dyno, it made just shot, 296 horsepower at the rear wheels and 400 Newton meters of torque. And it's quite responsive. Now, it's my first turbo, and the exhaust is a stock 3-litre heat exchanger. So it's completely stock exhaust with a J pipe. I just wanted to go for the simplest, easiest way to get it going so that I could get it in the car. And just, this was a learning experience for me. As I said, I didn't make it to make as much power as I can. I can rebuild the engine, and I'm going to do that. So the next step for me is to rebuild it, and I've already got parts on order. I've got a set of custom pistons from Carrillo or CP in the US, so they're sort of in final designing, and I've got a bigger crankshaft, I've got some new barrels, and so the plan is to punch it out to 3.5 litres, and I'll probably change the turbo as well, but again, to start with, I'll just leave that turbo on there. I will fit a set of extractors or headers to get a little bit more flow, and I think it's going to work really well. What am I aiming for? To be honest, 300 horsepower in one of these little cars is a bit of a handful. Like it's fun. Don't get me wrong, it's not a handful. I've got massive tyres on the back, heaps of grip. I'm not going to run out of traction anytime soon, but it's fun. It's spirited. Every man and his dog's out running today, but it's fun. So 300 horsepower is fun. It's spirited. Like it goes really well. So I'm thinking that if I can get a fairly safe 400 horsepower out of a 3.5 litre and a turbo, I'd be pretty happy. Got to remember that I am running the stock gearbox. It is still a 915 gearbox, And even though the gearbox has been rebuilt with a reinforced side plate and a one-piece billet bearing retainer plate, it's still a 915 gearbox. Now, they do say that they can handle 300 horsepower happily. So I think 400 horsepower and using a bit of common sense, it should be fine. But we'll find out. So, how much did it cost? Well, to do the conversion, I think for someone that's planning to do the conversion, you'd probably want to budget, well, this one cost me about $15,000 in parts. And that's not too bad. So $15,000 Australian's about 7 or 8,000 US. And obviously the labour's free. I did all the labour myself. Yeah, so is it worth doing? Hands down, yeah. I think for 15 grand Aussie to get 300 horsepower out of one of these engines is phenomenal. I mean, a standard rebuild, anywhere you go, I mean, depending on where you go, you're going to be paying somewhere around $35,000 to $40,000 for a standard rebuild, 25 to 30 if you're really lucky, and that's to get standard performance. But yeah, but if you've got an engine that's in reasonable condition, it doesn't have any broken studs, and you know it's not burning a lot of oil, what better way than spend $15,000 to $20,000 and end up with 300 horsepower and just smiles for miles. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try and start it up and just get a little audio recording so you can hear what it sounds like.